Hello, my dear friends. They made girls bleed twice, once by nature and once by ritual. The first blood was hidden in cloth, buried under fire, and watched in silence. From there, everything a child had once known was stripped away piece by piece. Mirrors were covered, names were carved, stones were pressed into skin, and even sleep was taken from them. Each act was simple, yet heavy, turning ordinary things like ash, water, or cloth into tests of fear and endurance. Tonight, you will walk through these forgotten rites and feel what it meant to become a woman in the Middle Ages. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now just dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If there was one moment that shifted a girl from childhood into the life of a woman in the Middle Ages, it was the first time she bled. This moment was not treated as something private or hidden. It was turned into a ritual, heavy with meaning, repeated through generations. Families did not ask if the girl was frightened, embarrassed, or confused. They simply carried out what tradition demanded. The ritual was called the blood annunciation, and it placed the girl at the center of the household in a way she could not escape. Her body became the reason for rules, silence, and restrictions that involved everyone under the same roof. The act began with an object that was both ordinary and symbolic. A piece of plain white cloth was prepared by the mother or the grandmother. It was not embroidered or decorated. It was not meant to be pretty. It was chosen because its pure color would reveal the first red stain clearly. The cloth was not offered to the girl as a choice. It was pressed upon her as a duty. The stain confirmed that her body had crossed into a new stage of life. This was evidence that could not be ignored. The girl may have wished to keep the moment private, but privacy was not an option. Everyone knew what the cloth meant once it was folded and carried to the hearth. The hearth was more than a place of cooking. It was the true center of the medieval home. Families gathered around it for warmth, food, and light. To bury the blood-stained cloth beneath its flames and ashes meant more than disposal. It meant binding her change to the very heart of the household. Her blood became a part of the house itself, hidden in its ashes, absorbed into its fire. This act did not require words. It was understood by everyone without the need for explanation. After the cloth was placed, the household entered 3 days of restriction. No one could touch the fire. No logs were added. No ashes stirred. The flame burned as it was, neither fed nor disturbed. Meals had to be prepared before, or families had to go without warm food. The silence of the hearth marked the silence of the girl's transition. This rule was followed strictly because people believed that disturbing the fire would break its purity. The fire had to remain clean while it held the blood within it. For the girl, those 3 days were often difficult. She could not help but feel the weight of her presence. She might not have understood fully why the hearth had to stay untouched, but she knew it was because of her body. She was told to stay quiet, to move carefully, and to accept that the rules were not for her comfort, but for the safety of everyone. To her, it may have felt isolating, but to her family, it was necessary. The ritual was not meant to be gentle. It was meant to be protective. The belief that menstrual blood carried both power and danger was not unique to this community. In many medieval villages, blood was seen as a force that could bring fertility but also misfortune. If left uncontrolled, it was thought to invite illness or bad spirits. The blood annunciation was the answer to that fear. By hiding the blood beneath the hearth, families believed they shielded themselves from harm. The cloth acted as both offering and defense. It is important to remember that the girl's feelings did not matter in these practices. She was treated as an object of tradition, not as a person with agency. It almost sounds absurd that a girl who could not choose her meals was suddenly made responsible for the sanctity of the family hearth. The imbalance between her lack of authority and the weight of her new role was stark. The ritual made the private body public. What should have been an intimate change became something for the whole family to manage. The girl's bleeding was not hers alone. It belonged to the household. Everyone was aware of the silence at the hearth. Everyone knew the reason for it. In this way, the most personal moment of a girl's life was made into a shared event. It feels similar to how modern families celebrate birthdays with large gatherings, where the ceremony is more for the parents and relatives than for the child. The blood annunciation was not a celebration, but it had the same structure. The family found meaning while the child had little choice. The memory of the ritual stayed with many women for life. They would remember the folded cloth, the smell of unturned ashes, the quiet around the fire, the cold food served at meals. These details marked the beginning of a womanhood more than any personal reflection. The household had turned her change into a symbol, and she could never return to the state of a child again. I think about this and see how customs like these gave people a sense of order, even though they must have felt heavy for the ones who had to endure them. The fear of chaos in the medieval mind was stronger than the comfort of kindness. When the 3 days ended, the ritual closed quietly. The heart was touched again. Wood was added. Flames rose with fresh strength. The ashes were stirred, and life returned to its normal pace. The cloth was gone, consumed by the fire, but its meaning was permanent. The girl had been transformed in the eyes of her family. She was no longer a child. She was a woman in the making. From that moment on, she would be seen differently, treated differently, and drawn into other rituals that would guide her further down the path. This first act was never the last. It was the start of a long series of customs meant to mark her journey into adulthood. Each step carried its weight. Each one took away more of her childhood and replaced it with roles defined by the community. The blood annunciation was only the beginning, but it set the tone. From now on, the girl belonged not only to herself, but to the order of the household, the rules of the village, and the demands of tradition. The silence around the fire was the first silence of many. It taught her that her body would always be watched, judged, and controlled by others. It showed her that she was no longer free to move through life as a child, and it warned her that every change of her body would bring new restrictions, new rituals, and new expectations. The end of those 3 days did not bring relief so much as preparation. Once the fire burned normally again, the family was already thinking ahead. The girl had crossed the first threshold. The next ritual waited for her, already shaped by tradition, already ready to remind her again that womanhood was not only her body's change but her community's claim. When the ashes of the hearth were finally stirred again, and the life of the house seemed to return to its steady rhythm, the girl was not allowed long to rest. Her body had marked her once already, and her family would not let the moment pass without another step. The blood annunciation had bound her blood to the fire, but that was only the beginning. The next ritual waited, one that aimed not at her body, but at her image. It was known in whispers as the severing of the mirror, and its meaning was to break her ties with childhood reflections. In many medieval homes, there was not a mirror in every corner as we might imagine today. A family might have only one, perhaps small, perhaps clouded by years of use, sometimes nothing more than a polished piece of metal. For a young girl, this mirror could be the one place where she recognized herself, where she saw her face, where she still thought of herself as a child. That simple piece of glass or polished bronze carried weight, and the family understood it, so the ritual made sure to claim it from her. The mirror was brought out, or uncovered if it was already placed upon a wall. Then a dark cloth, usually black, was lowered over it. The action was slow and deliberate. The covering of the mirror symbolized the end of one stage of life. The girl was required to stand before it and press her hand to the cloth. She was told that this gesture was her farewell to her childhood, Her face was hidden from her, and in that moment, she was made to believe she was stepping away from her reflection. It may sound small, but in a household where superstition and control shaped daily rhythm, the mirror held unusual power. People believed that mirrors could hold fragments of the soul. To see oneself was not simply to look, but to connect with a piece of spirit that might wander. The family feared that if a girl who had just bled were to stare into the glass, her spirit could be unsettled, or worse, harmed by wandering forces. The cloth was meant to protect her, but it was also a way to take away the little freedom she had of seeing her face. From that day, she was forbidden to look at her reflection for 7 weeks. The mirror remained covered, or if it was used by others in the house, she was not permitted near it. Her hair was combed by others, her appearance judged by others, but she herself could not check the details. She had to trust her mother or grandmother to tell her whether she looked neat, whether her clothes were proper, and whether her face was clean. In effect, her sense of self was handed over to the eyes of others. For the girl, this was another reminder that she no longer belonged fully to herself. Her body was under watch, and now even her reflection was withheld. The act of covering the mirror stripped her of a private moment, one of the few she might have had. It is almost laughable that a girl who could not even choose when to see her face was somehow expected to prepare for the duties of womanhood. Yet such contradictions were built into the life of medieval households. The mirror ritual also reflects the obsession with control that surrounded medieval ideas of purity. If the fire had to stay clean, then so too did her soul. Blocking her from her reflection was thought to guard her spirit from confusion. It makes me think of how modern parents sometimes restrict a teenager's use of a phone or computer, claiming it is for their safety, even if the teenager feels it is simply punishment. The logic, in both cases, rests on fear of influence and the belief that control equals protection. During those 7 weeks, the girl adjusted to living without her image. She became used to others deciding for her. Some girls might have felt restless, others might have felt numb. What was clear was that the ritual had taken something ordinary and made it into a rule. Every morning when she rose, she knew she would not see her face. Every evening when she lay down, she knew the cloth still hung heavy over the glass. These repeated absences carved a lesson into her mind. The family, of course, believed they were guiding her. They explained little, but they acted firmly. If she reached for the mirror, she would be pulled back. If she asked, the answer was silence or a stern shake of the head. The community reinforced the idea that mirrors were dangerous to women in transition. To them, it was not cruelty but protection, not punishment but duty. I cannot help but see how much of this was about control disguised as care, a pattern that repeated again and again in these rituals. By the end of the 7 weeks, the girl was different, if only in how she thought of herself. When the cloth was finally lifted, she would look into the glass again and see a face that had changed. Whether or not it truly had, the gap in time made her believe she had crossed another threshold. She was told to understand that the girl she'd been before was gone, and the woman she was becoming had arrived. The mirror had been a line, and she had stepped over it. This was the lesson her family wanted her to hold on to. She was not a child who could look freely. She was a woman whose reflection had to be managed by rules. The ritual had not given her freedom, it had taken it away, in the name of protection. When life returned to normal and the cloth was folded and put away, the girl could see herself again. But the lesson lingered. She had learned that her body, her blood, and even her face belonged to something larger than her own will. She had learned that the community marked every stage of her change with objects and rules. She had learned that the path ahead would not be chosen by her but laid out long before she walked it. The ritual of the mirror ended, but like the ritual of the hearth, it did not stand alone. Each one led to another, a chain of customs that bound her tighter to her role. The family had kept her blood in the fire, had taken away her reflection, and were now ready to impose further steps. As soon as the black cloth was lifted, another ritual was prepared, waiting to send her away from the house and into a place of seclusion. When the mirror was finally uncovered and the girl's face returned to her own sight, the household did not pause. What had been taken from her was now replaced by something even heavier. The rituals followed each other in close steps, so that there was no chance for the girl to forget her new status. The next stage was the blood seclusion. It was not held within the safety of the home, but took her out, away from the fire and the mirror, and into a place set apart. The rules of this practice were firm, and everyone in the village understood them. She was led from the house to a small hut in the fields, or sometimes to a corner of the animal shelters. This was not a choice. It was a requirement that when the body of a girl showed its first bleeding, she must be separated. The idea was that her presence carried danger if left inside the home. She could not touch the fire, because it would no longer be clean. She could not touch water, because it would no longer be pure. She could not touch other people, because her contact was believed to bring misfortune. The only way to prevent this was to remove her, to keep her out of the normal space of life. The hut was often simple, a small wooden frame or a structure of a rough stone. Sometimes it was nothing more than a corner in a stable where animals were kept. The girl entered and stayed there for 7 days. The rules were strict. She was to remain inside, not wandering, not mixing with others. She was not permitted to cook, to wash, or to share food with her family. If she needed water, it had to be left outside for her to take. If she needed food, it was set down where she could reach it without touching the one who brought it. This isolation was treated as absolute. Each day, at some appointed hour, an older woman from the village would approach. She would not enter. She would not even step too close. Instead, she would tap the door of the hut with a wooden stick. The sound served as a reminder that the girl was not forgotten, but also that she could not be touched. The stick kept the distance between them. After the knock, the woman might leave food or check that the girl answered, but she never broke the boundary. This pattern repeated for all 7 days, a slow rhythm of separation. For the girl, the experience must have been lonely. She had been moved from the hearth and denied the mirror. Now she was denied contact altogether. She sat alone, with only the sounds of the outside world reaching her. Animals, wind, or the steps of someone passing might remind her that life continued while she was hidden. Inside the hut, there was little to do but wait. It almost seems cruelly comic that the very first experience of womanhood for a girl was to be locked away like a sickness. But that was how communities believed they kept themselves safe. The reasoning behind the blood seclusion reflected a deep fear of disorder. Blood was thought to attract spirits, illnesses, or misfortune. If a bleeding girl touched the fire, the family feared the food would spoil. If she touched water, they thought the well might be poisoned. If she touched people, they worried they could fall ill or lose their luck. By isolating her, they believed they were protecting not only her but everyone else. It is not so far from how, in modern times, people quarantine the sick, even if the sickness is not contagious in the way they imagine. Separation gives a feeling of control, whether or not it has a true effect. The days in the hut were long. The girl might spend them sitting, lying, or pacing. She had no tasks because the normal duties of women were withheld from her. She could not cook or spin. She could not fetch water or tend the fire. All she had was time. For some, that time became a weight of shame, as if they were being punished. For others, it was a heavy silence, teaching them that their bodies' changes brought danger. In either case, the memory would be marked deeply. The family, meanwhile, accepted this as custom. They did not question it, even when it made daily life harder. To have a daughter removed meant one less pair of hands to work, one more mouth to feed separately. Still, they believed the risk of keeping her inside was greater. Villages were built on shared rules, and if one family failed, others would notice. Respect for tradition was stronger than convenience. I think of this and realize how much power fear held over these communities. It shaped rules that hurt the very people they claimed to protect. After 7 days, the girl's seclusion ended. The hut was emptied. The bedding or straw inside was often burned, and she was led back into the home. But she didn't return as she had left. The 7 days had been a statement. She had been removed because she was now different. She came back carrying that difference openly, marked not by a scar but by the memory of being untouchable. Her family would look at her as changed, and she herself would feel it. The return was not celebrated loudly. It was quiet, practical, and firm. She was permitted to touch the fire again, to use water, and to share food with others. But she knew that her body had set her apart. This knowledge was now hers to live with, and the family would never again see her as a child free of restriction. The blood seclusion did not exist alone. It was another step in a chain of rituals. First the fire, then the mirror, now the hut. Each one stripped away more of the girl's freedom. Each one taught her that her life was bound by rules outside her control. The medieval mind saw safety in these acts, order in the restrictions, and purity in the silence. The girl herself may have felt fear, confusion, or sadness, but the rituals were not designed for her comfort. They were designed for the community's peace of mind. When she returned to the household, she carried that lesson with her, and before long she would face another act, one that would press ashes upon her skin and mark her body again in the name of purification. The steps of her journey into womanhood were not finished. They had only just begun. The return from the hut was not a return to freedom, but a passage into another ritual that pressed the lesson of control even deeper. Before the girl could join the household again as before, she was taken aside and prepared for what was known as the ash ritual. Everyone in the village knew of it, and every girl who had begun her bleeding was made to endure it. This was not an option, not a private choice, but a duty set out by long tradition. Ashes were gathered from the hearth, the same place that had once held her blood in silence. These ashes were not left in their dry state. Water was poured in, stirred until it formed a dark, thick paste. A clay bowl often held the mixture, placed carefully so that nothing was spilled. The smell of burnt wood and damp earth filled the space. The girl sat quietly, often on a wooden stool or low bench, while older women stood nearby. One of them, usually the most respected elder, reached her fingers into the paste and lifted it as if she were handling something sacred. The ritual began with her forehead. The paste was smeared across the skin, leaving a cool, gritty streak. The ashes clung to her brow, dark against her pale face. Then her wrists were taken, one by one, and rubbed with the mixture until black marks formed circles. Finally, her ankles were covered in the same way. These 3 places were chosen with intention. They were thought to be points where impurity could linger, where dangerous forces might enter, or where blood might leave behind its taint. To cover them was to seal them. Once the markings were complete, another step followed. A small broom made of straw was lifted and tapped against her shoulder 3 times. The blows were not heavy, but they were deliberate. Each one meant to drive out what was considered harmful. The tapping was done in silence, except for the faint sound of the broom against her skin. After this, the elder began to speak words in Latin. The girl might not have understood them, but the meaning was clear to those who listened. These words were believed to call out the impurities, to pull away the danger of blood, to leave her clean in spirit. For the girl, the sensation was strange. The wet ashes cooled her skin, the straw brushed her shoulder, and the foreign words echoed around her. She sat still because she had no choice. This was not a moment to resist. It was a moment to submit, to let the community do what it thought was necessary. It is almost ridiculous that a young girl who had done nothing but bleed for the first time had to be treated as though she carried a curse. Yet that was the belief, and the ritual reinforced it. The use of ashes carried deep meaning. Fire was central to the home, and ashes were its remains. To rub them on her body was to coat her with the symbol of cleansing fire, as though the flames had touched her without burning. It reminds me of how modern people sometimes use sanitizers or sprays after touching something they fear might carry germs. The logic is similar, even if the material is different. In both cases, the act is meant to protect, whether or not it truly changes anything. The presence of Latin words also mattered. Few people in the village understood the language, but priests used it, and it carried weight. To hear strange words spoken over her body gave the ritual a sense of authority. The people believed that the sounds themselves had power, that the unknown syllables could chase away invisible dangers. For the girl, the foreign speech may have only added confusion. Still, she accepted it, because resistance would have been unthinkable. I think of it now and see how much of this was about creating order through mystery, layering authority over the simplest of acts. After the ritual, the girl was left with the markings of ash drying on her skin. She carried them for the rest of the day, sometimes until they wore away. Every time she looked down at her wrists or ankles, she saw the smudges and remembered what had been done. Her body had been marked once again, not by her own will, but by the hands of others. These traces were meant to remind her that she was no longer a child, that her life now belonged to rules that had existed before her and would continue long after her. The community saw the ritual as protective. They said it pulled away the bad blood, sealed her body against misfortune, and prepared her to rejoin her family without danger. They did not consider it cruel or unnecessary. To them, it was kindness. Without it, they feared illness, disaster, or unrest. The ritual was not meant to punish, but to safeguard, at least in their eyes. The girl herself might not have seen it that way, but her opinion was never asked. By the time the ritual ended, she was declared safe. She could step back into the household, share food, and use water again. Yet she carried the knowledge that she had been singled out, painted, struck lightly, and spoken over in a language she did not know. The memory of those sensations would stay with her, just as the seclusion had, just as the covered mirror had. Each ritual was a step deeper into a world where her body was not her own. The ash ritual closed with the belief that the danger of blood had been removed, but in truth, it only added another layer of control. The girl was now tied not only to the fire and the mirror, but to the ashes of the hearth themselves. Her path was not finished. Ahead of her lay another act, one that would demand she watch the clothes of her childhood destroyed in flames, so that even her garments could not remind her of the girl she once was. The women of the household moved quietly through chests and corners, gathering the dresses, shifts, and cloths that had belonged to her younger years. Nothing was spared. Even garments that had long since grown too small were brought out and piled together. To them, each thread carried traces of the girl she had been, and those traces had to be removed. Once the collection was complete, the pile was carried into the yard where the ritual would take place. A small circle was cleared on the ground. Stones were sometimes placed around it to contain the flames. The clothes were laid in a heap, and before the fire was set, salt was sprinkled across them. The salt was believed to purify and to keep away unwanted spirits that might cling to the fabric. Only after this preparation was a torch brought forward. When the flames caught, the fabric twisted and curled, giving off smoke that smelled sharp and bitter. The girl stood in front of the fire and watched as the garments of her childhood vanished in the heat. She was not allowed to look away. The ritual required her to witness every stage. The colours of the fabric disappeared first, then the shapes collapsed, and finally, nothing was left but ash and fragments of charred cloth. The heat pressed against her face, and the smoke made her eyes sting. But she remained still because that was what the family demanded. They believed that by watching the destruction, she would understand the lesson the girl she had been no longer existed. When the flames had burned down and the pile cooled into soft grey ash, the next step followed. She was told to bend down and take a piece from what remained. Sometimes it was a crumb of fabric turned black, sometimes only a clump of dust. That piece was tucked close to her chest, inside her clothing, and she was instructed to keep it there for 3 days. The closeness to her heart symbolized carrying the memory of her childhood one last time before letting it go. After 3 days, she could discard it, but by then the past was considered buried. The weight of the ritual pressed on her in more ways than one. She remembered what it felt like to wear those garments, the comfort they had given, the warmth they had provided on cold nights. Now they were gone, not because time had worn them out, but because fire had been ordered to erase them. It is almost absurd that a girl who never had a say in the clothes she wore had to stand and watch while those very clothes were taken and destroyed in front of her eyes. The fire turned her memories into smoke, and she was told to accept that nothing of them could return. For the community, this act carried no cruelty in their minds. They believed the destruction was necessary. They said that if a girl kept her old clothes, she might cling to the soul of a child, unable to take on the role of a woman. Fire was the only sure way to prevent this. It purified what was old and cleared the path for what was new. It is similar in a way to how modern families might clear out childhood toys when a child grows older, convincing themselves that letting go of objects will help the child grow, even when the child feels attached. The logic of separation repeats itself across time, though the methods change. She carried the ash for 3 days, pressed close to her chest, a physical reminder of what had been lost. It left smudges on her skin and a faint smell that did not wash away easily. Each time she felt it shift against her, she remembered the fire and the pile of clothes. The reminder was not meant to comfort, but to solidify the lesson that childhood was gone. I cannot help but see in this act how communities tried to erase not just a stage of life, but even the memory of it, forcing the girl to hold her loss until it sank deeply enough that she could not ignore it. When the 3 days passed, she released the ash. By then, the family believed she had crossed another threshold. She was no longer tied to her younger years. Her body had bled. Her reflection had been denied. Her presence had been separated. Her skin had been marked with ashes, and now her clothes had been taken by fire. Piece by piece, her past was stripped away, until only the image of a woman-to-be remained. The household looked at her differently after the burning. They expected her to accept her role with quietness, to take her place among the women without hesitation. The fire had finished what the seclusion and the ash markings had begun. She was not only changed in body, but reshaped in memory. The clothes that had once tied her to innocence were gone, and with them, a chapter of her life was sealed. Yet the rituals did not stop. Each one closed with the beginning of another. Even as she let go of the ash pressed to her chest, preparations were underway for the next stage. This time it would not be about fire or fabric, but about scent, as her body was to be washed in steam and herbs, stripped again of anything the elders feared might linger from the blood. The steps of her journey continued, and she had no choice but to walk them. A basin was placed over the fire, filled with water and stuffed with herbs that were thought to have the strength to cleanse. Rosemary leaves floated on top, their sharp scent rising as the water boiled. Mint was added, releasing a cool fragrance that filled the air, and onion skins gave the mixture a bitter edge that clung to the steam. This was the preparation for what the family called the scent removal, another step in the long series of rituals that marked a girl's passage into womanhood. The belief was simple but strict. The first bleeding left behind not only impurity, but also an odour that had to be driven out of her body. For them, smell was tied to spirit, and only steam could purge what blood had released. The girl was guided to sit near the basin. The boiling water made the air heavy and wet, the kind that pressed against the skin and filled the lungs. She was made to sit over it, covered by a cloth that trapped the steam around her body. The warmth rose from the basin in steady waves, soaking into her pores until she was drenched in moisture. For 20 minutes, she sat this way, unable to escape. Her body flushed and sweating as the herbs seeped into her skin. This was not about comfort. It was about discipline, a lesson that she must endure what the women before her had endured. The time was carefully counted. An older woman, often her mother or an elder from the village, stood nearby with the duty of ensuring the ritual lasted long enough. If the girl shifted or tried to lift the cloth for air, she was told to remain still. The heat was meant to cover every part of her body, to seep into her hair, her chest, her legs, her hands. No corner of her skin was left untouched by the steam. The family believed that this saturation would drive away the bad air they thought clung to her after menstruation began. When the 20 minutes ended, the cloth was lifted away, and the girl emerged dripping with sweat and condensation. Her body was sticky, her face flushed, her limbs trembling from the intensity of the heat. But the ritual was not complete. A black cloth was brought forward, rough but absorbent, and with it her body was dried section by section. No part was allowed to be skipped. The elder wiped her forehead, her arms, her chest, her legs, even the soles of her feet. The black fabric collected the moisture, leaving streaks across her skin. The act was slow, deliberate, and carried the weight of ceremony. The choice of black fabric was deliberate. Black was a colour of absorption, a shield against impurity. As the cloth passed over her body, it was thought to draw out what the steam had loosened. Every stroke of the fabric symbolized a clearing away of what remained from her bleeding. By the time the girl was dry, the family believed her body had been cleansed not only of sweat, but of unseen residue that might harm her or others. For the girl, the experience was exhausting. She had sat in suffocating steam, endured the heat, and then been dried like a vessel emptied of its contents. She was not asked whether she felt better. She was simply told that she was now clean. It is almost ridiculous that a girl who had done nothing but live through a natural change was treated as though her body was something that needed to be fumigated like a dirty room. Yet in the medieval household, this was a normal response, carried out without question. The ritual reflects the deep association people once held between smell and morality. To them, a bad odour was not just unpleasant, it was a sign of corruption, disease, or even evil. The use of strong herbs and onion skins was meant to overwhelm and replace whatever scent they feared lingered from menstruation. It is strangely similar to how modern people reach for perfumes, sprays, or disinfectants whenever they worry about cleanliness, even when nothing is truly wrong. The desire to cover and control the body's natural state has not disappeared, though the methods have changed. The memory of the ritual could not be shaken easily. The girl would remember the sensation of sweat dripping into her eyes, the heat that made it difficult to breathe, the fabric pressed over her skin until she was raw. She would remember how her hair clung to her face and how her chest ached from the thick air. These were not just physical details. They were marks left on her sense of self, reminders that her body was no longer only hers but an object for others to regulate and purify. I cannot help but think that while these customs were meant to protect, they also robbed the girl of her comfort and dignity. They reduced her to a body to be managed, stripped of choice. The household, however, saw the outcome differently. They believed the ritual made her ready again to sit among others, to eat from the same bowls, to sleep under the same roof without fear of spreading impurity. The women of the family told themselves they were giving her protection, while the men simply accepted that it was necessary. To question it would have been to question the very order that kept their world in place. When the ritual ended, the basin was emptied, the herbs discarded, and the black cloth hung out of sight. But the meaning of what had happened lingered. The girl was now free of the smell they feared, marked as clean by the standards of her community. She could step back into the rhythm of daily work, but she knew that this freedom was temporary. The rituals had come one after another, and more still waited for her. By now, she had been bled into cloth, denied her reflection, sent into seclusion, smeared with ashes, and forced to watch her childhood clothes destroyed. The The steam bath of herbs was only another layer of the same message: she was no longer a child, and her body was no longer her own. The village had claimed her, purified her, and reminded her that she existed within their rules, not outside them. Life in the household resumed, but the next act was already prepared. If steam and cloth had cleansed her, the next step would touch what was perhaps most symbolic of a woman's body, her hair. Soon she would be taken to the well at midnight, her head bent under cold water, her hair wrapped tightly away for days. The journey into womanhood pressed on without pause. The day's work ended, and the night grew heavy, but the girl was not allowed rest. Another ritual waited for her, and this one demanded precision. It was not performed in the daylight, not even in the evening. It was done only at midnight, the hour believed to carry the strongest divide between purity and danger. The family prepared for the ritual of the midnight hair washing, another step to mark her change. By this stage, she had already endured fire, ash, seclusion, and steam. But still her body was thought to need cleansing. Her hair, in particular, was seen as holding the essence of her transition, and it had to be treated with care. At the appointed time, water was drawn from the village well. This was not just any water. It had to be taken exactly at midnight, not a minute before or after. The person chosen to carry it was often a woman trusted by the community, someone believed to have a strong fortune. She lowered the bucket, lifted it carefully, and brought it back with solemnity. The water was cold, untouched by the warmth of the day, and this coldness was seen as proof of its strength to seal away impurity. The girl was led outside or to a quiet space where the water could be poured. Her head was bowed, and the trusted woman poured the well water slowly across her hair. It ran over her scalp, through the strands, and down her back. The cold struck her sharply, making her shiver. But no one paid mind to her discomfort. The water was not meant to comfort her. It was meant to strip her of the last traces of what the community feared remained from her bleeding. The one who performed the washing was not chosen at random. She had to be the mother of 3 healthy daughters. This detail mattered deeply to the people of the village. It proved that the woman knew fertility, that she carried strength in her womb, and that her touch could pass that fortune to the girl. She served as both guide and witness, ensuring the act was not only performed but sanctified by her presence. The girl did not choose her. The choice was made for her, another reminder that her body and her life were managed by others. The washing was not brief. Every strand of hair had to be drenched. The woman poured and poured until the water was gone, and then she combed her fingers through the girl's hair to ensure that no spot was left dry. The cold settled into the girl's scalp and shoulders, making her body shake. She endured in silence because silence was expected. The act was ritual, not kindness, and any sign of resistance would have been seen as weakness. When the water was finished, the next step began. A length of white linen was brought forward. It was clean, unmarked, and woven tightly so it could bind her hair without slipping. The linen was wrapped around her wet hair again and again, pressing the strands into a bundle against her head. Once tied, it was not to be removed for 3 days. This meant she slept with it, worked with it, and carried it everywhere she went. The wrapping symbolized containment, the idea that her change had now been secured. Her hair, a sign of her youth and her femininity, was no longer free but bound under the control of fabric. For the girl, the experience was heavy. Her scalp ached from the tightness, and the dampness of her hair pressed against her skin for hours. By the 2nd day, the cloth smelled of the well water and of her sweat. Still, she was not permitted to remove it. Only when 3 days had passed could the linen be untied. Until then, she lived with the constant reminder of the ritual's hold on her body. It is almost comical in a bleak way that something as natural as hair had to be wrapped and hidden, as though it were a dangerous force. Yet this was how her community viewed the body of a girl in transition. The choice of white linen mattered. White represented purity, the same reason the cloth of her first blood had been chosen in that colour. By binding her hair with it, the family symbolically sealed away what they feared and presented her as cleansed. It is not so different from how modern people use white gowns in ceremonies like baptisms or weddings, as though a colour can guarantee purity. The logic of symbolism remains. Even if the meanings change, the memory of the midnight hair washing could last as long as any of the earlier rituals. She would remember the sting of cold water poured at the dead of night, the sight of the woman chosen to cleanse her, the weight of linen binding her hair until it hurt. She would remember how she lay at night, her head pressed uncomfortably against the bedding, unable to relax fully because of the tight wrap. Each sensation marked another stage of her forced passage from childhood. I find it striking how each of these acts, rather than offering comfort, stripped away her freedom and replaced it with symbols meant to reassure everyone except her. The family, meanwhile, saw the ritual as a success. They believed her hair was now safe, her body cleansed, her spirit balanced. They took the damp linen as proof that she had been bound to purity. In their eyes, she had taken another step away from danger and closer to the role of a woman. They did not see her discomfort. They saw only the completion of tradition. After 3 days, the linen was finally removed. Her hair fell out, stiff and matted, carrying the smell of the well water. She combed it slowly, feeling relief at last, but the act had already done its work. The memory of being bound lingered, and so did the knowledge that more rituals were still ahead. This was not the end. This was one more step in a path that seemed endless. The midnight hair, washing closed with the removal of the linen, but the family was already preparing the next stage. The girl had been bled, smeared, burned, steamed, and bound. Now she would be marked again, not with water or cloth, but with earth itself, as clay would be pressed into her skin and her name spoken in whispers to remind her of the role she must now accept. The long days of being bound in linen and forced to carry the smell of the well water finally ended. But the moment the cloth was removed from her hair, the family made ready for another act. This time, the ritual drew not from fire or water, but from earth itself. It was called the clay smearing, and it was meant to mark her body with the soil of the village, while at the same time marking her identity with a new name. In this step, the girl's hands, her feet, and even her forehead were claimed by the touch of others, and with that touch her old self was buried. The earth chosen for the ritual was not taken from just anywhere. It had to be dug from beneath the roots of the great tree at the edge of the village. That tree was considered older than anyone alive, its roots deep and its shadow long. People believed the soil beneath it carried strength and stability, and so the women gathered there with small clay jars. They dug with care, scooping the dark, damp mud and carrying it back to the place where the ritual would be performed. By the time they returned, the girl was already waiting, seated with her hands open and her feet bare. The mud was thick, cool, and heavy. It was pressed into her palms, smeared so that it filled the lines of her hands and left a dark coating across her skin. Her feet were treated the same way. The mud spread between her toes and pressed against her soles. The sensation was strange, cold against her warm body, but she was told to stay still. The family said this was the earth reclaiming her, grounding her, keeping her from wandering away in spirit. To resist was unthinkable. When her hands and feet were coated, the other women of the village came forward one by one. Each dipped a fingertip into the jar of mud, lifted it, and placed a dot on the girl's forehead. They did this in silence except for a whisper. As each woman marked her, she bent close and murmured the girl's true name 3 times. The name that had been spoken to her as a child was repeated in whispers, but only to be laid to rest. When the ritual ended, no one would call her by it again. From that day, she would carry a new name, one chosen for her entry into womanhood. The moment was heavy. The girl stood or sat as woman after woman came forward, touching her, leaving marks, whispering words she could hear but could not answer. She felt the cool mud drying on her skin, the weight of so many fingers pressing her forehead, and the sound of her name repeated again and again until it no longer felt like hers. By the end, she was covered in dots of earth, her palms and feet dark with mud, and her old identity fading with every whisper. This ritual carried meaning beyond the physical. To smear her with earth was to bind her to the land of the village, to say that she belonged not only to her family but to the community itself. Her body was marked with the soil, her identity remade by the voices of the women. It is almost grimly amusing that a girl who had no power to choose her name had to stand still, while others decided to bury the one she had lived with. The act of renaming reflected a wider belief that childhood names could not be carried into adulthood. People thought that a child's name was fragile, too weak to withstand the weight of womanhood. To keep it was to invite weakness or misfortune. By giving her a new name, they claimed to give her new strength. It is not unlike how in the modern world some people take new names at milestones, like religious ceremonies or marriages, to signal a change in their lives. For the medieval girl, though, the choice was not hers. It was forced upon her by tradition. She would remember this moment as one of transformation, even if she didn't want it. The feeling of mud drying in the lines of her hands and feet, the smell of earth clinging to her skin, the faint traces left on her forehead long after the women had gone. These details stayed with her, pressing the lesson into her memory. I think of it now and cannot help but notice how much of her old self was deliberately erased. Not only her freedom, but even the sound of her name. After the ritual ended, the mud was washed from her hands and feet, but the dots on her forehead were left to dry naturally. By the next morning, the village no longer called her by her childhood name. They spoke her new one, and she was expected to answer to it without hesitation. The old name was gone, spoken only in whispers during the ritual, buried under the roots of the great tree from which the earth had been taken. The family looked at her differently now. They said she had been remade, not only purified in body, but reshaped in spirit. The renaming was a seal on everything that had come before. She had bled into the fire, lost her reflection, been hidden in a hut, covered in ashes, burned her clothes, steamed in herbs, bound her hair, and now even her name was gone. Piece by piece, the girl she had been was stripped away until nothing was left but the woman the community wanted her to become. The ritual of clay and renaming did not stand alone. It led directly into the next stage. Once her body had been marked with earth and her identity replaced, she would be made to kneel on stones and hear words spoken that declared her blood as part of the order of the world. The path of rituals pressed forward, never slowing, never leaving her time to breathe. The mud of the previous ritual had barely dried before the girl was led toward another stage of her journey. Now her body had to be placed into a position of submission, not in private, but in front of the eyes of the village. The act was known as the kneeling of blood, and it served as both a public declaration and a physical trial. The community had to see her lowered, forced onto the ground, her body pressed into discomfort so that everyone would know she had crossed into womanhood. This ritual left no space for denial. Once completed, it gave her entry to the sacred centre of the village, though at a cost that weighed on her knees and her spirit. The space for the ritual was prepared in advance. A patch of earth in the square or near the communal altar was cleared, and small stones were scattered across it. They were not sharp enough to cut the skin, but rough enough to press into the flesh and make kneeling painful. The girl was brought forward and told to kneel on this surface. There was no cushion, no comfort. Her knees bore the full pressure of the stones, and the ache began immediately. This was intentional. The ritual demanded not only symbolic submission but also physical endurance. In her hands, she was given a bouquet of dried flowers. The blooms had lost their colour, the stems brittle and sharp against her palms. They were chosen precisely for this reason. Fresh flowers would have been too gentle, too pleasant. The dry ones represented the fading of her childhood. Beauty turned stiff and fragile. Life turned into memory. She was told to hold them tightly, and so the stems scratched her skin, pressing into her fingers as she knelt. Around her, the women of the village formed a circle. At the front, the elder woman, often called the head of the village, stepped forward. She was the one who spoke the words of declaration. Her voice rose clearly so all could hear. She's been cut by the sky. She's bled red. She has left behind the dream. These words were not meant for the girl alone. They were for the whole community, so that everyone would know she had been marked by blood and transformed. The words stripped away any possibility of secrecy. Her bleeding was not private. It was announced aloud as if it belonged to everyone. The girl remained on her knees, the stones biting into her flesh, the flowers digging into her palms, while the elder spoke. She could not move, could not shift her weight, could not release her grip. She was made to embody the pain of transition. To the villagers, this pain was proof of her readiness. To endure without complaint showed obedience. To obey showed that she had accepted her new role. For the girl, the experience was grueling. Her legs burned, her arms trembled, her back stiffened as she tried to remain upright. She listened to words that made her body sound like something marked by divine violence, cut by the sky, as if what had happened to her was not natural but imposed from above. It is almost mocking that a girl who had no power over her own body had to hear that the heavens themselves had carved her fate. Yet she had no voice to object. The ritual carried deep symbolic weight. The stones pressed her down to remind her of the weight of womanhood. The dry flowers in her hands reminded her of the death of innocence. The words spoken by the elder reminded her that her body's bleeding was no secret. Everything about the ritual tied her change to suffering, submission, and public exposure. It is not unlike how, in modern ceremonies, like graduations or initiations, people are made to perform gestures they may not understand, only because tradition demands it. The difference here was that the ritual inflicted physical pain as part of its lesson. When the declaration was finished, the elder signalled that the ritual had reached its end. The girl, her knees sore and her hands raw, was told to rise. She was guided to the village altar, a place she had never been allowed to touch before. For the first time, she stretched out her hand and placed it on the worn surface of the stone. This was the reward for her endurance. She was now permitted to connect with the altar, the heart of the community's spiritual life. To touch it was to be recognized, to be accepted into the circle of women who bore the responsibility of blood and fertility. The moment of contact with the altar was brief, but it sealed everything that had come before. The girl felt the cool stone under her hand, rough from years of use, and knew that her status had changed. From that moment, she was bound to the altar and what it represented. Her body was no longer hidden or separate. It was public, declared, and tied to the life of the village. I cannot help but see how these rituals turned private moments into spectacles, forcing the girl to give pieces of herself away in order to be recognized. After the ritual, the dried flowers were taken from her hands and burned, their brittle stems reduced to ash like her old clothes had been. The stones on which she had knelt were left in place, ready for the next girl who would endure the same. Life returned to its normal rhythm for everyone else. But the girl carried the ache in her knees for days. The pain was her reminder that she had knelt before the village and been declared changed. The community considered the kneeling of blood one of the most important steps. It was the first time the girl was allowed to touch the altar, the first time she was seen openly as someone who had bled. From this moment on, her life was tied not only to her family but to the entire village. She was responsible for carrying forward the same customs, for repeating the same words to another girl one day. The ritual left her with no illusions. She had been taken from her clothes, her mirror, her reflection, her name, and even her comfort. Now she had been placed on stones, made to hurt, and forced to hear her change spoken as though it were a divine decree. Her journey was far from over, but she already knew what awaited: more rules, more rituals, more symbols pressing her body into the mould of womanhood. As she stepped away from the altar, the family was already preparing the next act. The community had marked her blood in public, but now her body would be bound in a more literal sense. A cord would be tied around her waist, and she would be told to carry it for days as a sign of her transition. The sound of her knees scraping against the stones and the sting of holding brittle flowers had not yet faded when she was prepared for the next step. Pain and endurance were never left to rest on their own. They were always followed by another mark, another layer of control. This time it was not about ashes, fire, or words shouted in public. It was about her body being physically bound so that she carried the sign of her transition at all times. The ritual was known as the binding ceremony, and it was simple in form but heavy in meaning. A cord was prepared, made from the fibres of flax or hemp, twisted 3 times to form a strong rope. The triple twist mattered. People believed that 3 strands held not just strength but protection, like 3 walls guarding against danger. The cord was measured to fit her waist, long enough to circle her, but short enough to press tightly. It was not a loose belt that could be adjusted. It was drawn snug, tied securely, and declared a boundary for her body. She stood while the cord was wrapped around her. The elder woman in charge made sure it sat across her stomach, the place seen as the centre of her fertility. The knot was pulled tight, leaving her feeling the pressure against her skin. From that moment on, she was told she must wear it without pause, day and night, whether working, sleeping, or walking. The cord remained. She was not allowed to untie it until the first bleeding cycle was complete. The rules were absolute. If the cord broke, it was treated as a sign that she had failed to hold her purity. The family would whisper of bad luck. The entire series of rituals, from the cloth of blood to the ashes, the steam, and the kneeling, would have to be repeated. The thought of starting over filled every girl with dread. The cord, therefore, was more than a physical tie. It was a constant reminder to move carefully, to live under the watch of others, to keep herself from error. The presence of the cord changed how she lived. It dug into her skin as she bent to her tasks. It rubbed when she tried to sit or lie down. It tightened when she ate. It loosened slightly when her body shrank with hunger. The sensation was always there, a pressure that never allowed her to forget the ritual. It is almost darkly humorous that a girl who had never been trusted with decisions was now expected to carry the weight of an entire ritual's success on a piece of cord tied around her waist. Every movement threatened to betray her. Every tug of the rope reminded her that her body was under constant supervision. The choice of hemp or flax fibres was not accidental. These materials were coarse and rough against the skin. They did not sit comfortably like silk or soft wool. They scratched and irritated, especially after days of wear. The irritation was deliberate. Comfort was never the goal. To suffer was to show strength. To show strength was to prove readiness. It is not unlike how modern people sometimes wear symbols of discipline, like uniforms or even fitness trackers, to prove control, even when those objects bring discomfort. The cord acted as both symbol and tool, pressing into her until the ritual's message was impossible to ignore. The girl carried the cord for 7 days. During this time, she was watched closely. Every morning, her mother or another elder would check the knot to see if it had loosened. At night, her movements were monitored to ensure she had not attempted to remove it. She was reminded constantly that the rope was not only around her body but around her fate. To let it break was to bring shame. To keep it whole was to bring honour. Her body responded with soreness. The skin beneath the cord reddened and sometimes blistered. The friction of daily movement made her tender. Still, she endured it because endurance was demanded. She knew that the pain was considered part of the lesson. Her discomfort was never treated with pity, only with watchful eyes to make sure she did not fail. I think of this and see how every detail of these rituals was built to tighten control, as though the community feared freedom itself and sought to bind it in every possible way. When the 7th day ended and her bleeding stopped, the cord was finally removed. The knot was untied carefully, the rope uncoiled from her waist, and she felt the sudden relief of freedom. But the marks on her skin remained. Red lines pressed into her flesh showed where the cord had sat. These marks were proof of her endurance. They told the story of 7 days lived under constant pressure. They were silent scars of a ritual she had survived. The cord itself was not kept. It was often burned or buried, destroyed so that its burden could not return. The family did not want it used again, fearing it carried the memory of blood and transition. The girl, meanwhile, remembered the weight even after it was gone. For days, she still felt the phantom pressure around her waist, as though the rope had sunk beneath her skin. The binding ceremony reinforced what the earlier rituals had already taught her. Her body was not her own. It was tied, watched, and judged according to the rules of others. Every movement of her life had to bend to the demands of tradition. The girl had little voice, but her body spoke through marks, through pain, through silence endured. When the cord was gone, she was told she'd passed another test. Her family looked at her as stronger, safer, and more controlled. The village saw her as ready for the next act. She did not have time to rest or to question. Another ritual was already waiting, one that would press bitterness into her mouth and test her ability to hold silence while the words of ancestors were spoken around her. The cord that had pressed into her waist was finally gone, leaving red lines that would fade slowly, but the community gave her no pause. Another step had to follow, and this one was less about the body's surface and more about its endurance in silence. It was called the Herb of Silence, and it tested not only the girl's discipline but also her ability to submit without words. The ritual was simple in action, yet it carried a weight that made the girl feel as though even her mouth was no longer her own. The centerpiece of the ritual was a small, round pellet made from bitter herbs. The women who prepared it gathered roots, leaves, and dried plants known for their sharp taste. They ground them together, mixed them with a little water, and shaped the paste into a ball no larger than a coin. This ball was called the Silent Herb, and it was given to the girl at the start of the ritual. Its bitterness was deliberate. The taste was meant to be unpleasant, a reminder that silence was not easy but had to be endured. The girl was told to place the pellet beneath her tongue. It softened with the warmth of her mouth, releasing its bitter flavour slowly. She was instructed not to chew it, not to swallow it, and most importantly, not to let it fall out. As soon as it rested under her tongue, the ritual began. An old woman, usually the eldest living in the village, sat before her and began to recite the long stories of the ancestors. These stories were not short. They carried on for a long time, filled with names, places, and customs that tied the community together. The girl had to sit still and listen. She could not speak. She could not shift the herb with her tongue too much or risk dropping it. The bitterness grew worse the longer it stayed. Saliva filled her mouth, making it harder to hold still. Her instinct was to swallow or spit, but both were forbidden. She endured while the old woman's voice carried on, steady and firm, recounting the ways of those who had lived and bled before her. The punishment for failure was clear. If the herb slipped from her mouth and fell, she would not only face shame, but also be required to fast for a full day. This was no light punishment in a time when food was precious. To go without eating meant not only hunger, but weakness during work. The fear of that penalty hung over her as heavily as the bitterness in her mouth. She pressed the herb with her tongue, keeping it in place, fighting the urge to spit it out. The act was less about the herb and more about control. It forced the girl to sit quietly, to listen without interruption, to submit to the authority of age and tradition. It is almost ironic that a child who had rarely been allowed to speak freely was now punished if she even let her mouth slip by accident. Silence was demanded at every stage of her life, and now it was given a physical form that burned her tongue and tested her patience. The herb itself was chosen not only for its bitterness, but also for its supposed properties. People believed that bitter plants cleanse the blood and harden the spirit. By holding the pellet in her mouth, the girl was thought to be absorbing strength from the plants, even as she suffered their taste. It reminds me of how modern people sometimes drink strong herbal tonics or health drinks that taste unpleasant, but are endured for the promise of benefit. The logic was the same. Hardship was thought to bring health and discipline. The old woman's recitation was not gentle. It was long and deliberate, meant to stretch the girl's endurance. She spoke of the first women of the village, of the rituals they had followed, of the sacrifices they had made. She listed names the girl barely knew, stories she could not question, lessons she was told to absorb. The girl's body grew tense. Her jaw ached from holding still. Her throat burned with the need to swallow. Still, she stayed silent because silence was demanded. The longer the ritual went on, the more the girl felt trapped. Her mouth was full of saliva. Her tongue pressed awkwardly against the pellet. Her stomach twisted with bitterness. She felt sweat on her forehead, not from heat, but from the strain of keeping still. She wondered how much longer the words would continue, but she knew she could not ask. To speak would be to fail. All she could do was endure until the old woman reached the end. I cannot help but see how every detail of this act was built to remind her that endurance, not comfort, defined her role in the community. When the recitation finally ended, the girl was permitted to spit out what remained of the herb. Often it had shrunk to a small lump